Tonight we're going somewhere very respectable. A drawing room in London, the 1860s. Heavy curtains, velvet, probably, in a deep jewel tone, pulled almost entirely shut even in the afternoon. Every horizontal surface carrying something. A vase, a framed photograph, a small ornamental clock, a dish of calling cards from people who came by and were, or were not, received. The women in this room are sitting very straight, because their corsets make any other posture difficult, and because sitting straight is what you do. Conversation moves carefully, like someone walking across a frozen pond. The weather. A recent sermon. A piece of music someone played at a gathering last week. Nothing indelicate. Nothing that would require anyone in the room to acknowledge that the world outside this room exists in the way it actually does. And just a few streets away, sometimes just one street away, an entirely different city. One that the people in this drawing room know about, in general terms, in the way you know about something you've decided never to look at directly. They know it's there. The men in this room have, some of them, been there. And by some unspoken agreement so universal it barely needed to be made, they have decided that the drawing room and the street outside it occupy different moral universes. That the curtains, if pulled tightly enough, make the world on the other side of them stop existing. Tonight we're going to open those curtains very gently. Before we do, a warm and genuine thank you for being here. If you're new to the Still Hour, welcome. This is a place for slow, curious storytelling about history, and I'm very glad you found it. If you've been here before, you already know how this goes, and I'm glad you're back. If something we covered tonight strikes you as interesting or surprising, or makes you want to know more, a like and a subscribe is genuinely the best thing you can do to help this channel keep going. It costs you nothing and it helps more than you might think. And if a previous episode or a conversation somewhere sent you here tonight, please drop a comment and let me know. I read them and I love them, and some of the best episodes on this channel started as a suggestion from someone who was listening in the dark. Tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is wherever you are. That information somehow never gets old. But you've done the useful things. You've liked, you've subscribed, you've settled in. Turn off the lights now. Pull the blanket up. Find whatever arrangement of pillows has recently been working for you. The configuration you've been quietly refining for weeks without really admitting you're doing it. And get comfortable, because tonight we're talking about all the things Victorian society insisted weren't happening, while quietly making sure they kept happening anyway. This is social history. This is class history. This is the story of a gap between public performance and private reality so wide you could fit an entire city in it, which, as it turns out, is exactly what happened. Here is what I want you to hold loosely in your mind as we go. How does a society maintain a public image of strict moral order while private life looks almost nothing like that image? Not in a cynical, knowing way, but as a genuine, serious, sustained effort that entire social institutions were built to support and an entire class of people worked extremely hard to maintain? What makes that kind of collective performance possible, and what makes it necessary? Who actually enforces the rules in a society like this? Because it's never quite as simple as saying, the powerful enforce the rules on the powerless, though that's certainly part of it. Sometimes the rules are enforced most harshly by the people who have the most to lose from being caught breaking them, and that gives enforcement a particular flavor, one that's less about genuine moral conviction and more about fear and appearance and the constant background anxiety of being found out. Who gets to break the rules? Because somebody always does. And in Victorian Britain, as in most societies throughout human history, the answer to that question follows a very familiar pattern, one that has everything to do with money and social position and gender, and almost nothing to do with actual virtue. What happens to the people who can't keep up the performance? The people who don't have the money to buy discretion, or who make a single mistake in a system that doesn't permit mistakes? Or who simply exist in a category of person that the system has decided is beyond respectability before they've done anything at all? Why do some of the Victorian values we grew up hearing about, the thrift, the modesty, the sexual restraint, the domestic purity, turn out, on closer historical inspection, to have been mostly aspirational? Who was holding these values up as a standard, and who was expected to actually live them? And perhaps the largest question of all, What does it tell us about any era at all, when the gap between what is publicly said and what is privately done is this wide? Not a small gap, not a modest and forgivable human inconsistency, but a structural, deliberate, socially enforced gap. A gap that the people living through it were, in many cases, entirely aware of and had made a kind of peace with. Those are the questions we're turning over tonight. Not to condemn the Victorians, they were complicated, contradictory people navigating a world changing faster than any generation before them had experienced. But to understand them, which is a more interesting project anyway. Britain, 1837 to 1901. 64 years under a single monarch. A stretch of time long enough to contain entire generations, multiple technological revolutions, and a shift in the shape of human life so dramatic that people living at the end of it could barely recognize the world they'd been born into. When Victoria came to the throne, most people still lived in rural areas. When she died, Britain was one of the most urbanized countries in the world. Factories had reorganized labor. Railways had reorganized distance. A new middle class had emerged, clerks and manufacturers, doctors and solicitors and shopkeepers and managers, people who had more money than their grandparents could have imagined, and none of the inherited social certainties that would have told them what to do with it. The Victorian values, we think we know, the modesty, the moral rigor, the elaborate domestic rituals, the way even table legs were allegedly covered for decency's sake, a story which is, as it happens, largely a later exaggeration, but which has persisted because it captures something true about the spirit of the thing. These were, in very large part, the values of this anxious, aspiring middle class. They were not universally held. They were not universally practiced. They were, more than anything else, an ideal, a performance, a signal sent by people who needed to signal it to other people who needed to see it. And behind that performance, as the Victorians' own extensive documentation of themselves makes very clear, an entirely different world was quietly continuing. Let's start with the word itself, because it's doing an enormous amount of work and it's worth understanding exactly what it meant to the people using it. Respectable. In 21st century English, this is a fairly mild word. We might use it to mean decent, or competent, or not obviously terrible. We describe a competent restaurant as respectable, or a fairly large crowd as a respectable turnout. But in Victorian Britain, and particularly in Victorian middle-class Britain, respectable was a word carrying genuine moral and existential weight. To be respectable was not just to behave well. It was to occupy a particular social category, a category that you could fall out of, that required constant maintenance, and that meant something very specific in terms of how the world would treat you. The growth of the British middle class across the 19th century was enormous and rapid, and it created a particular kind of social anxiety that underpins everything we're going to talk about tonight. Before the industrial era, social position in Britain was largely determined by birth. You were born into a class and, with some exceptions, you lived and died in it. The rigid hierarchy of the aristocracy and the landed gentry at the top, the working poor at the bottom, the church and certain professions occupying their established places, this was a system that was unjust in many ways, but it was a system that most people understood and that told them where they stood. What the Industrial Revolution did was create an enormous number of people who didn't fit neatly into that old hierarchy. People who had earned money rather than inherited land. People who were educated but not genteel. People who were, by the standards of their grandparents' generation, extraordinarily comfortable, and who had no inherited social code to tell them how to live that comfort, or what it meant, or how to distinguish themselves from the people below them now that the old distinctions of birth and land didn't straightforwardly apply. The answer they found, and it was a collective, cultural answer, worked out through conduct manuals and sermons and novels and magazine articles and 1,000 small social negotiations over the course of several decades, was respectability. A code of behavior so detailed, so comprehensive, and so publicly visible that performing it correctly became its own proof of social standing. If you dressed correctly, furnished your home correctly, spoke correctly, attended the right church at the right times, paid your debts promptly, maintained the correct forms in your correspondence, and ensured that your household presented a particular face to the world, then you were demonstrating, loudly, constantly, unmistakably, that you were a certain kind of person. A respectable person. A person who had not only money, but character. And character, in Victorian middle-class ideology, was everything. More than wealth, theoretically, though wealth certainly helped. Character was what distinguished the respectable from the unrespectable, the deserving from the undeserving, the people whose company was sought from the people whose company was avoided. The specific rituals of this respectability would fill several books, and in fact they did. The Victorians produced an astonishing number of conduct manuals, household management guides, and etiquette books aimed squarely at the anxious middle-class household that wanted to get this right. The rules were intricate. There were rules about calling cards, who left them, when, in what order, what it meant when one was turned down at a corner rather than left flat, how long you waited before calling in person after leaving a card. There were rules about mourning dress that could govern a household for years after a bereavement, the precise gradations of black crepe and parramatta and bombazine, and the specific number of months before you could allow yourself half-mourning, and what half-mourning actually permitted. There were rules about what topics were appropriate for conversation in mixed company, rules that effectively excluded anything connected to the body, to money in its specifics, to religious controversy, to politics in any heated form, and to most of what was actually happening in the world outside the drawing room. What's important to understand about all of this ritual is how much effort it required. Specifically, how much effort it required from women. The Victorian ideal of the household placed the wife and mother at its moral center. She was, in the dominant ideology of the period, the angel in the house, a phrase from a popular poem of the era that became shorthand for an entire set of expectations. Pure, selfless, spiritually elevated, a civilizing influence on the rougher moral life of her husband and children, the keeper of the domestic space that represented safety, morality, and God's grace in a fallen commercial world. This was, on its face, a kind of elevated status. Women were being told that their domestic sphere was sacred, that their moral influence was supreme, that they occupied a position of spiritual authority within the home. What it meant in practice was an enormous, uncompensated, never-finished labor of performance. The household had to look right at all times, to all visitors, regardless of what was happening beneath the surface. The conversation had to stay within the correct channels. The children had to be presentable. The servants had to be managed, and the complicated social dynamics of a Victorian household with live-in staff required constant, careful attention. And through all of this, the woman of the house was expected to appear effortless, because effort was itself a kind of impropriety, a suggestion that the household was somehow straining, that the performance was a performance rather than simply the natural expression of a well-ordered life. And the standard she was held to was simply different from the standard applied to her husband. A man's character in this period was certainly important, but it was understood to be something that operated primarily in the public commercial world. His honesty in business, his reliability, his position in his church or his club. The domestic and moral sphere was hers, which meant that any failure of domestic propriety was hers too, even when it had very little to do with anything she had done. This asymmetry, the fact that the standards were different and the consequences for failing to meet them were different, and the expectations themselves were constructed in a way that was never quite achievable and never quite forgivable when not achieved, is the thread running through everything we're going to talk about tonight. The Victorian cult of respectability was a genuine cultural phenomenon, held with genuine conviction by many of the people who practiced it. But it was also, structurally, a system that looked very different depending on whether you were the one performing the virtue or the one whose virtue was being performed for. There is a term that Victorian social critics use themselves, not a term we're imposing retrospectively from a more enlightened era, but a term the Victorians coined and deployed in their own debates about their own society. They called it the double standard, and the fact that they had a name for it, that it was discussed in print, that reformers wrote pamphlets about it, and that the phrase entered common usage, tells you something important. This was not a hypocrisy that went unnoticed. It was a hypocrisy that was documented, argued about, and, in the end, largely permitted to continue anyway. The double standard, in its Victorian incarnation, referred specifically to the completely different set of moral expectations placed on men and women when it came to sexual behavior, or indeed to any behavior that brushed against the category of respectability. And the asymmetry was not subtle. It was so stark that it was written directly into the law of the land. Consider divorce, which in Britain before 1857 required a private act of Parliament and was therefore effectively available only to the extremely wealthy. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 reformed this system and created a civil divorce court, a genuine reform. But the grounds on which divorce could be sought were not equal. A husband could divorce his wife on the grounds of adultery alone. A wife, by contrast, had to prove not only adultery but an additional aggravating factor, cruelty, or desertion, or incest, or bigamy. The logic underlying this difference was stated fairly plainly by those who argued for the legislation. A wife's adultery was considered a more serious injury to her husband, because it introduced the possibility of illegitimate children into his household and threatened the integrity of his lineage. A husband's adultery, while regrettable, was considered to pose no equivalent threat to his wife's fundamental interests. The asymmetry wasn't hidden. It was the design. Beyond the law, the social consequences were equally lopsided. A woman whose reputation was questioned, not destroyed, not proven against her, merely questioned, could find herself in a social situation from which there was almost no recovery. The Victorian social network, particularly at the middle and upper levels, operated on a system of calls and introductions and vouching. You were admitted into social circles because someone already inside them was willing to vouch for your character. If your character became doubtful, the vouching stopped. Invitations stopped arriving. Doors were no longer opened at your ring. And because so much of a middle-class woman's economic and social security depended on her position within that network, on her ability to make a good marriage, or to maintain the social connections that protected a household from isolation and poverty, losing that position was genuinely catastrophic in a way that had nothing to do with mere social embarrassment. A man in the same period could engage in behavior that would have permanently ruined a woman and face almost no equivalent consequences in his social or professional life. Men of perfectly well-documented private lives maintained respected positions in their professions, their clubs, their churches, their families. The knowledge of their behavior existed. It circulated quietly in the conversations that happened in rooms where women were not present, but it rarely attached itself to a man's public standing in any serious way. Because men's public standing was evaluated on different criteria entirely. A man's business was his public business. His private life was, with a few exceptions and in most circumstances, his private business. This was not a secret. It was so much not a secret that it generated enormous social anxiety in women who understood the system they were operating within, who knew that the line between respectability and ruin was, for them, vanishingly thin, while for their husbands and brothers and fathers it was wide and forgiving and frequently overlooked. Contemporary women's writing from the period, in letters and diaries that were never intended for public circulation, documents this anxiety with a particularity and a sadness that is still striking to read about. The constant awareness of the asymmetry. The knowledge that one's entire life's security rested on a reputation that could be damaged by other people's choices, by rumor, by proximity to the wrong kind of situation, by circumstances entirely outside one's control. What did women do with this knowledge? Because this is where the history becomes genuinely interesting rather than merely grim. Some women navigated the system with extraordinary skill, developing a kind of social intelligence that was, in its own way, a remarkable achievement. The careful cultivation of the right alliances. The maintenance of social relationships with women of higher standing who could provide protection through association. The management of information, knowing what was known about you, knowing by whom, knowing which friendships might provide a cordon around dangerous knowledge. This was not passive. It was active, strategic, exhausting, and socially invisible work. Other women formed networks with each other that operated, in practice, as mutual support systems. Systems that provided the kind of financial and social assistance that the official institutions of Victorian society did not. Communities of women who knew each other's situations, who helped each other navigate difficult circumstances quietly, who provided the kind of practical solidarity that didn't make it into the conduct manuals or the newspaper columns but that ran through Victorian social life like a second, underground river. And some women pushed back more publicly. The growing women's reform movements of the later Victorian period included campaigns specifically targeted at the double standard, campaigns that named it and argued against it with considerable force. The campaign around the Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s, legislation that subjected women suspected of prostitution in certain garrison towns to compulsory medical examination, while doing nothing equivalent to their male clients, became a significant public cause, arguing precisely that a law embodying the double standard so nakedly was a law that needed to change. The women who led this campaign were, by the standards of their time, doing something genuinely radical. They were naming in public a thing that polite society had decided to know about only in private. The double standard was, in the end, a kind of contract, and like most social contracts, its terms were not the same for everyone who had to sign it. The women who suffered most under it were rarely the women who had agreed to it. And the men who benefited most from it were often the same men who stood up in church and endorsed, with complete apparent sincerity, the moral values it so comprehensively failed to embody. Let's step outside the drawing room now, and go out into the city. London in 1837, the year Victoria came to the throne, had a population of somewhere around 1.5 million people. By 1901, when she died, it was approaching 7 million. To put that in perspective, within a single human lifetime, London added more people than it had contained at its starting point. It became, in the course of the Victorian era, the largest city in the world, a distinction it held with a complicated mixture of imperial pride and genuine civic alarm, because the infrastructure, the housing, the sanitation, and the social organization of this city were not keeping pace with its growth. This is important context for everything we're going to talk about in this chapter, because the specific social arrangements that Victorian respectable society preferred not to discuss were, to a significant degree, products of this extraordinary, unmanaged expansion. When you grow a city that fast, in an era before effective public health administration or social housing or labor regulation, you create conditions in which very large numbers of people have very few options. And people with very few options make choices that more comfortable people prefer not to think about, not because those people are morally inferior, but because the choices available to someone in desperate circumstances are genuinely different from the choices available to someone in comfortable ones. The geography of Victorian London was a geography of extremes, and these extremes could exist in almost comic proximity to each other. The respectable squares of the West End, those wide, quiet streets of cream-painted townhouses where the scenes we've been imagining are set, existed within walking distance of areas of genuine, grinding poverty. Not historical poverty, the kind we read about and process at a safe distance, but poverty of a specifically brutal and well-documented Victorian kind. Whole families living in single rooms, streets where the paving was irregular and the drainage was non-existent, where children worked from an age we would now consider unthinkably young, where the life expectancy was genuinely decades shorter than it was for people living in the same city, on the same postal streets, just a few turnings away. And between these worlds, there was a constant movement. The servants in those cream-painted houses came from somewhere, and they had families somewhere, and when their working life in service ended, which it did for a woman when she married, or when she became too old, or when she was dismissed without a character reference, which is to say without any reference at all, which rendered her effectively unemployable in respectable service, they went back somewhere. The men who delivered coal to respectable households, who swept their chimneys, who brought their vegetables and meat, went home somewhere at the end of their working days, and where they went was not visible to the households that depended on their labor. What Victorian London had, in other words, was an enormous informal economy that operated in the spaces between the formal, respectable economy and its clients. And this informal economy was documented with extraordinary thoroughness by the Victorians themselves. This is one of the genuinely fascinating things about the Victorian era. It was an era of intense self-investigation. The social survey, the systematic, statistical examination of urban poverty and its conditions, was essentially a Victorian invention, and the Victorians pursued it with almost compulsive energy. Government reports, parliamentary inquiries, journalistic investigations, charitable surveys. The Victorians produced an enormous body of documentation about the exact conditions they found most uncomfortable to acknowledge in polite society, and they produced it specifically because they found those conditions uncomfortable. The documentation was, in a sense, the respectable society's way of relating to the world it preferred not to see directly. They could investigate it, they could quantify it, they could produce a committee report about it, and that act of investigation was itself a kind of moral performance, a demonstration of concern and seriousness that sat rather uneasily alongside the continued existence of the conditions being investigated. The major social surveys of Victorian London, conducted by investigators who spent months and sometimes years walking the streets, interviewing residents, mapping poverty block by block and street by street, produced detailed accounts of London life that are still startling in their specificity. They documented, among many other things, the range and variety of livelihoods that people in the poorer parts of London had constructed for themselves in the absence of stable formal employment. Street selling of every conceivable variety. Piecework taken in at home, paid by the garment or the match or the box at rates that required working 17 or 18 hours a day to produce a barely subsistence income. Begging in its many forms and its complex social organization. And other industries that the survey's authors sometimes catalogued with the same careful, dispassionate statistical thoroughness they brought to everything else, and sometimes left in strategic gaps in the record, depending on who was funding the investigation and who was expected to read it. What the geography and the economies of Victorian London tell us, if we look at them clearly, is that the respectable city and the disreputable city were not two separate cities. They were one city, deeply and necessarily interconnected. The wealth that furnished the drawing rooms we began in came from industries whose labor conditions were a source of periodic public scandal. The food on respectable tables moved through supply chains that included people living in conditions that no respectable household would have acknowledged. And the social arrangements that the drawing room pretended not to know about were not confined to distant, separate parts of the city. They were embedded in the same streets, the same economies, the same daily life. The curtains weren't keeping the outside world at bay. They were, at best, a polite agreement not to look directly at what everyone could see. There is a specific cognitive and social skill that the Victorians developed to a very high level, and it's worth spending some time appreciating it, because it's genuinely impressive in its way. The skill was this: the ability to maintain, simultaneously, a complete working knowledge of a subject in certain contexts, and a total, unwavering public ignorance of the same subject in others. To know something thoroughly in a medical journal, and not know it at all at a dinner table. To discuss something with complete frankness in a parliamentary committee, and with complete blankness in a drawing room. To be, in practice, two entirely different people depending on who was in the room. This is not exactly hypocrisy in the ordinary sense, or at least, it's a more structured and more socially organized form of it than the word hypocrisy usually implies. It was a system. It had rules. And like most Victorian systems, those rules were not applied equally to everyone. Take medicine. Victorian medicine was, across the course of the 19th century, becoming increasingly scientific and systematic, and Victorian medical writing addressed subjects with a directness that would have been genuinely shocking in polite company. Medical journals and textbooks from the period discussed the biology of reproduction, the transmission of disease, the specific health consequences of various social conditions, and much else besides, in careful clinical detail. These were not secret documents. They were read by doctors, by medical students, by educated men with an interest in natural science. They were sometimes read by women too, though often with difficulty, since women were excluded from medical training for most of the Victorian period and access to this literature was correspondingly limited. But the information in those documents did not flow freely into general social discourse. There was an agreed-upon line between what could be discussed in professional, scientific, or governmental contexts, and what could be acknowledged in the social sphere. A woman going to see her doctor might receive information in that specific context that she could not have received from any other source, that she could not, in many cases, have found in any form accessible to her outside that consulting room. And when she left the consulting room, she was expected to return to a social world in which that information did not exist. Contemporary writers on social reform, and there were many of them throughout the Victorian period, producing pamphlets and journalism and books addressed to the respectable reading public, navigated this constraint with considerable creativity. They had things they wanted the reading public to know about conditions and practices and social arrangements that a comfortable middle-class audience was choosing not to notice. And they had to find ways to convey this information that were acceptable to that audience's self-image, ways that allowed the reader to receive the information while maintaining the fiction that they were encountering it for the first time. This produced a very particular style of Victorian reformist writing, one that scholars of the period have spent considerable time analyzing. The rhetorical move of "let me draw back the curtain," an almost literal metaphor, given the curtain drawing rooms where the readers sat, was deployed constantly. The implied audience was always a respectable person of goodwill who simply hadn't known about these conditions, and who, once informed, would be moved to support the cause of improvement. The possibility that the respectable reader already knew, in general terms, and had simply chosen not to engage with that knowledge, was rarely stated directly. It was, after all, the reader's money and the reader's sympathy that were being solicited. The strain of maintaining this double vocabulary was real, and it left traces. Contemporary letters and diaries, the more private the document, the more clearly this shows, sometimes reveal a kind of exhaustion with the performance. The effort of maintaining, in public, an ignorance that was not felt in private. The slight absurdity of conversations that had to navigate around well-known subjects using circumlocutions so elaborate they would have been funny if they weren't also exhausting. A respectable household might discuss the need to avoid a particular area of town without ever specifying what exactly was to be avoided there. A concern about a young woman's health might be discussed with great seriousness for a long time before anyone allowed the actual diagnosis to be named, even in a room full of adults who all knew perfectly well what the diagnosis was. For women, this constraint had a particular irony. They were the designated moral guardians of Victorian society, the keepers of the domestic pure space, the embodiments of the virtue that the drawing room was meant to represent. And they were also, very deliberately, kept ignorant of the specific facts about the world that would have been most relevant to their own lives and the lives of the people they were supposed to be guarding. The information that existed in the medical journals, in the government reports, in the conversations of the clubs and the professional societies, information about health, about risk, about the actual conditions of social life outside the drawing room, was often specifically withheld from them in the name of protecting their delicacy. The argument for this withholding was essentially circular. Women were pure and innocent and therefore needed to be protected from knowledge of impurity. Their continued ignorance was what maintained their purity. Therefore, protecting them from knowledge was protecting their virtue. What it also did, of course, was protect the information advantage held by the men who had access to that knowledge and who were, in some cases, the subject of what was being kept secret. What everyone knew and nobody said was, in other words, not an accident. It was a social technology. It served a function. And the function it served was not, in the main, the protection of innocent minds. It was the maintenance of a social arrangement that a great many powerful people found very convenient. Let's come to the sharpest edge of all this, because the history is not just about ideas and social arrangements and the interesting gap between what people said and what they did. It is also about real consequences borne by real people, and those consequences fell with a consistency that is both predictable and genuinely awful to look at clearly, on women. Victorian Britain had a developed infrastructure for managing women who had, by whatever route and through whatever circumstances, fallen outside the category of respectability. This infrastructure had many branches. Some of them were formal and institutional. Others were informal, social, economic. The quiet closing of doors, the withdrawal of employment, the ending of a particular kind of life with no formal procedure and no appeal. The institutions that existed specifically to receive fallen women. a category that the Victorians themselves used, with all the moral weight the metaphor implies, ranged from explicitly charitable establishments to facilities that occupied a more ambiguous position. There were homes established by charitable organizations, often with religious affiliations, that offered shelter and sometimes training in domestic work to women who had no other refuge. These homes were, in many cases, genuinely motivated by compassion, and they provided real practical assistance to women in desperate circumstances. But they also came with conditions. Conditions about behavior, about labor, about the length and terms of residence, about the spiritual and moral education that was understood to be part of the rehabilitation process. The woman who entered one of these homes was entering an institution, with all that the word implies, a place with its own rules, its own hierarchy, its own understanding of who she was and what had happened to her and what shape her future should take. The Magdalene laundries, a phrase that has, in more recent decades, become associated primarily with their Irish Catholic version, which persisted far into the 20th century, were also present in Victorian Britain in various Protestant forms. Institutions specifically designed to receive and employ women considered to need moral rehabilitation, often through laundry work, which was considered both practically useful and symbolically appropriate as a form of cleansing. The labor was real and often very hard. The conditions varied considerably between establishments. And the question of whether a woman entered voluntarily or under family or social pressure that made voluntary a complicated word was often difficult to answer. The workhouse, the institution that formed the last resort of Victorian poverty in general, held a particular terror for women in this situation. The new Poor Law of 1834 had reorganized poor relief around the principle that the workhouse should be less comfortable than the worst conditions of independent life on the outside, so as to discourage its use. For women with an illegitimate child, a situation that could result from assault as much as from choice, and which the system did not consistently differentiate between, the workhouse might be the only institutional option available. And entering the workhouse, once done, attached its own mark of social degradation that was almost as permanent as the original situation that had made it necessary. What could actually tip a woman into this situation? This is the part that is most important to sit with, because the answer is very little. A single pregnancy outside of marriage, regardless of the circumstances. The failure of an engagement that had lasted long enough to damage a reputation. Employment in a household where she was subjected to unwanted attention from an employer or a family member and then dismissed, often without reference, when this became inconvenient to the household. A rumor, which could be entirely without foundation, that attached itself to a name and proved impossible to detach. Poverty itself, the simple, structural poverty of a working woman with no family support and no income, which made certain choices feel less like choices than like the only remaining option. The loss of a character reference was especially devastating in its practical consequences, because the entire system of Victorian domestic service, the largest category of female employment in the period, ran on references. Without a good character from a previous employer, a woman could not get a new position in service. Without a position in service, she had very limited access to the legitimate economy of women's labor. And the character reference was entirely within the power of the employer to grant or withhold, without appeal, without oversight, and without any obligation to be truthful in either direction. Women could also lose their children. The legal position of an unmarried mother in Victorian Britain was extremely precarious. She had no automatic legal claim on her child in any formal sense, and a child could be taken from her, placed in an institution, or given to another family member with very limited recourse available to her. A married woman who left her husband, even in cases of severe cruelty, could lose her children entirely under the doctrine that had historically assigned children as. And once you see that pattern, you start noticing it everywhere in Victorian life. Because the gap between appearance and reality wasn't just about reputation. It showed up in medicine, in publishing, in the law, in almost every institution that claimed to be protecting public morals. Let's start with medicine, because this is where the Victorian double standard gets genuinely fascinating in a way that would make any historian lean forward slightly in their chair. Here is the thing you have to understand about Victorian public discourse and the human body. Officially, the body was not a subject for polite conversation. Certain words were not said. Certain topics were not raised. There are accounts of households where even chair legs were considered slightly indecorous to mention directly, and while historians have argued about how widespread this particular delicacy actually was, the spirit of it is real enough. The Victorian social performance required a kind of studied vagueness about anything involving human physicality. You danced around things. You implied. You referred, if you referred at all, with the lightest possible touch. And then you pick up a Victorian medical textbook. And it is, to put it plainly, extremely thorough. The same era that produced etiquette manuals insisting that certain anatomical words should never pass a lady's lips also produced an enormous clinical literature that discussed the human body in comprehensive and frank detail, because medicine, by its very nature, could not afford to be coy. Doctors needed to know things. Medical students needed to be taught things. And so the professional literature of Victorian medicine, circulating quietly through the right institutions, among the right people, in the right professional context, contained an extraordinarily detailed picture of exactly the subjects that polite conversation refused to acknowledge. There is something almost comical about this once you see it clearly. The Victorians built, on one hand, an elaborate public culture of bodily reticence, and on the other hand, a comprehensive professional record of the body they were publicly pretending not to notice. And both existed simultaneously, without anyone apparently finding this particularly contradictory, because they operated in different registers, for different audiences, with different social permissions attached to them. This split found perhaps its most interesting expression in the world of patent medicines and tonics, which were enormously popular throughout the Victorian era. You could walk into a chemist's, or order by post from any number of advertisements in the back pages of the popular press, and purchase remedies for conditions that no advertisement would name directly. The language of patent medicine marketing was a masterclass in euphemism. There were tonics for female complaints. There were remedies for nervous exhaustion and debility and the weakness that attends certain stages of life. There were preparations recommended for irregularities and female delicacy and those difficulties which the sensitive constitution sometimes encounters. Nobody was confused about what these things meant. The euphemisms were transparent. Everyone operating within this system understood perfectly well what was being discussed. But the layer of polite indirection served a social function that had nothing to do with actual information transfer. It maintained the fiction of decorum while allowing commerce, medicine, and daily life to proceed in their actual, embodied, thoroughly non-abstract reality. And here is where it gets particularly interesting, because many of these patent tonics contained ingredients that were, by modern standards, quite startling. Some were essentially alcohol, at concentrations that would make a modern pharmacist blink. Others contained compounds that were, in the Victorian era, entirely legal and available over the counter. The respectability of the bottle, the tasteful wording of the label, the dignified advertisement in a reputable publication, all of this wrapped substances in an aura of propriety that the active ingredients might not, on their own, have commanded. Again, not unique to the Victorians. But the thoroughness of the performance is remarkable. Then there is the question of women's health, which occupied a genuinely strange position in Victorian medical culture. On one hand, women's health was discussed with enormous professional seriousness within the medical literature. The development of modern gynecology and obstetrics as formal medical disciplines happened largely in this period, and the clinical detail of that literature was substantial. On the other hand, public discussion of women's health, even in educational contexts, even with the best practical intentions, ran into the same wall of propriety that governed every other bodily subject. The result was a situation in which women could be significantly disadvantaged by information gaps that male patients were less likely to encounter, simply because the social rules around female respectability made certain conversations harder to have, even with a physician. There were reformers, and we will come to them shortly, who argued this was not a minor social quirk but a serious public health problem. If a woman could not straightforwardly discuss her symptoms with a doctor, or a doctor could not straightforwardly explain a diagnosis to a female patient, without both of them navigating a performance of elaborate delicacy, then the patient might go away less informed than she needed to be. The etiquette in this reading was not protecting anyone. It was simply making things harder for the people who could least afford it. Meanwhile, outside the consulting room, urbanization was creating public health problems on a scale that the existing systems were simply not equipped to handle. The rapid growth of Victorian cities, and London in particular, which roughly doubled in population across the middle decades of the 19th century, put enormous strain on housing, sanitation, and water supply. The connection between contaminated water and diseases like cholera was not immediately obvious, and even after it became better understood, the institutional response was slow and contested. The great engineering projects that eventually transformed urban sanitation, the sewer systems, the improved water infrastructure, the public health legislation, were hard-won, expensive, and controversial. They required accepting, publicly and officially, that cities were not in fact the orderly, respectable environments that the social performance of Victorian public life implied. This, too, is a kind of double standard, though a different kind from the personal moral ones we have been discussing. Victorian cities were simultaneously the proud symbols of industrial civilization and, in certain neighborhoods and certain seasons, genuinely dangerous places to live. Acknowledging this fully would have required confronting how far the reality of working-class urban life fell short of the official story. So it was acknowledged partially, gradually, reluctantly, and usually only when the evidence became impossible to ignore. The honest doctors knew all of this. The medical literature captured it, documented it, argued about it. But the knowledge moved slowly from the professional register into the public one, because the public register had all those carefully maintained proprieties to observe. Both things were real. Both things were Victorian. If medicine gave the Victorians a private professional language for the subjects their public culture refused to discuss, then publishing gave them something even more interesting, a way to discuss those subjects publicly in enormous print runs to mass audiences while maintaining complete deniability about enjoying it. And the mechanism for this was so elegant, so thoroughly satisfying in its ingenuity, that it is difficult not to feel a warm admiration for it, even from a distance of 150 years. The trick was simple. You packaged scandal as moral instruction. Here is how it worked. Victorian newspapers were, in certain respects, extraordinarily frank. The coverage of divorce proceedings, in particular, was detailed to a degree that would surprise anyone whose mental image of Victorian publishing is all careful restraint and tasteful omission. Divorce cases were matters of public record. Court reporting was legitimate, respectable, even civic-minded journalism. And divorce cases, by their very nature, involved the specific details of private life that polite society officially refused to acknowledge in any other context. So you would read in an entirely respectable publication a detailed account of exactly the kinds of private arrangements and domestic irregularities that no other section of that same publication would ever directly address. And the framing made it all perfectly acceptable. This was not prurient interest. This was serious journalism about the moral state of society. The reader was not entertained. The reader was informed, cautioned, perhaps appropriately appalled. The reader came away knowing considerably more about the specifics of a particular private life than they had before, but in a spirit of moral seriousness that placed the whole enterprise on entirely defensible ground. You can almost feel the knowing wink across the centuries. Criminal trials worked similarly. Coverage of cases involving fraud, bigamy, certain categories of assault, and a variety of other offenses could contain a great deal of specific information about subjects that the official moral culture preferred to leave unexamined, and all of it wrapped in the respectable language of justice, accountability, and public information. The newspaper was performing a civic function. It was holding wrongdoers up to public scrutiny. It was, if anything, upholding the moral values of the era by making their violation visible and consequential. That the readership found this enormously entertaining was presumably coincidental. This same alchemy, scandal wrapped in moral disapproval, transgression packaged as cautionary tale, shaped much of the most popular Victorian fiction. The sensation novel, which was enormously fashionable from roughly the 1860s onward, made an art form of exactly this technique. Sensation novels dealt in secrets, deceptions, bigamy, forgery, madness, and the dark surprises hidden behind respectable domestic facades. And they did so under the cover of moral seriousness, because the resolution of the plot almost always reasserted the proper order of things. Wickedness was exposed. Deceptions were uncovered. The comfortable house with its terrible secret was finally, satisfyingly, aired out. The novels were extremely popular. Readers consumed them eagerly, in serialist form in magazines and periodicals, then in the 3-volume format that Victorian lending libraries favored. And critics and reviewers were often quite severe about them, which, from a marketing perspective, was not entirely bad news, since a severely reviewed sensation novel was a sensation novel that everyone was talking about. The moral disapproval, again, functioned as a kind of amplifier. It gave respectable readers permission to be interested. There was also, running alongside this more publicly visible trade in packaged scandal, a rather more quietly circulating world of publications that did not bother with quite so much moral scaffolding. The Victorian era produced a considerable amount of printed material that operated below or beside the official respectable publishing world, periodicals, pamphlets, and books that circulated among particular audiences through particular networks, without aspiring to the front windows of respectable booksellers. The existence of this material was not exactly secret. The authorities were aware of it and periodically attempted to suppress it, but it occupied a different register from the official publishing world, and the traffic between the two registers was, again, more porous than the official story acknowledged. What is particularly charming, in a historical sense, is the way the mechanisms of moral disapproval and the mechanisms of public appetite fed each other so productively. A publication that was condemned was, by that very condemnation, more interesting. An account of something shocking, once it had been publicly shocked about, could circulate further and faster than it might have managed without the assistance of official outrage. The Victorians understood this dynamic perfectly well, even when they preferred not to say so directly. And here is where the familiar feeling comes in, because you probably do not need to think very hard to identify modern equivalents of exactly this pattern. The breathless moral outrage that is, functionally, free advertising. The detailed coverage of a scandal that is framed as a warning but consumed as entertainment. The packaging of transgression in a layer of disapproval thick enough to make it socially acceptable to enjoy. It is an extremely old technique. The Victorians simply refined it with particular thoroughness, and had the printing press to scale it to a mass audience. One more thing worth noticing about Victorian publishing before we move on, the sheer volume of it. The 19th century saw a transformation in the economics and technology of printing that made published material cheaper, more widely available, and more varied than it had ever been before. This was genuinely revolutionary, and most of it was entirely above board and straightforwardly improving. Cheaper Bibles, educational texts, improving literature, the great Victorian novels we still read today. But the same technology and economics that made all of that possible also made everything else possible. The machinery did not discriminate. And so the Victorian era, for all its reputation for careful moral gatekeeping, was also one of the most productive eras in the history of popular publishing in almost every category you might care to name. The curtain was very carefully maintained, but it was a curtain hung in a room that was considerably livelier than the curtain suggested. All of this, the medical double standards, the publishing industry's careful management of scandal, the legal inequities, the moral codes that bent conveniently for the people with the social power to bend them, did not go entirely unnoticed or unchallenged. The Victorian era was also, and genuinely, a great era of reform. And it is worth spending some time with the people who tried to close the gap between what Victorian society said it believed and what it actually did, because their stories are in some ways the most illuminating part of this whole picture. The easiest reforms to understand, in retrospect, were the ones focused on concrete, practical problems. The public health campaigns, the sanitation legislation, the reforms to working conditions in factories and mines. These were genuinely difficult and important achievements, and they required sustained effort against real institutional resistance. But they did not require challenging the fundamental moral logic of Victorian society. They could be framed, and usually were framed in the language of the era's own values: the duty of the prosperous to the poor, the obligation of the state to protect those who could not protect themselves, the Christian responsibility to alleviate suffering. The reformers who focused here were, in many cases, deeply conventional people in terms of their personal lives and social positions. Their radicalism was practical rather than philosophical. The harder work, and this is where things get genuinely courageous, in a way that deserves to be acknowledged directly, was the work of challenging the double standards themselves. Think about what that required. If you were going to argue in the Victorian era that the moral and legal rules which applied to women should either apply equally to men or should be reconsidered for everyone, you were not simply proposing a policy adjustment. You were challenging something that the entire official culture of the era had invested enormous energy in presenting as natural, proper, and morally necessary. You were saying, publicly, that the emperor was not wearing all the clothes that everyone had agreed to compliment him on. And the social consequences for that kind of honesty could be severe. Victorian society's enforcement mechanisms for social propriety were, as we explored in Part 1, both powerful and flexible. Flexible in the sense that they could be conveniently overlooked for the right people, but powerful in the sense that they could be applied with real force to anyone who made themselves inconvenient. A woman who spoke too plainly about the legal disadvantages of her position could find herself characterized as improper, unladylike, or worse. A man who raised the same issues publicly might find his professional and social reputation damaged in ways that were difficult to trace and impossible to formally contest. The system was very good at punishing people who pointed out how it worked. And yet the reformers kept going. The campaigns around what was called the marriage question, which encompassed a gradually expanding set of arguments about women's property rights, the conditions of divorce, and the legal position of married women, produced remarkable and sustained public advocacy over many decades. The Married Women's Property Acts, which gave women progressively greater legal control over their own property and earnings over the course of the second half of the 19th century, were the result of organized, persistent, public argument by people who understood perfectly well that they were challenging a deeply entrenched set of assumptions. The arguments were careful, legal, and strategically modest. Reformers often asked for less than they believed was just, because they understood that the realistic path to change ran through what could actually be achieved in the short term. There were also reformers who took on the specific legal double standards we have already discussed: the unequal application of laws around marriage, separation, and moral reputation, which in practice meant that women bore significantly greater legal vulnerability than men in domestic arrangements that went wrong. The arguments here were harder to make publicly, because they required being more direct about exactly the subjects that propriety was designed to keep vague. Reformers who made these arguments had to name things that official culture preferred to leave unnamed, and to do so in public, in print, with their own reputations exposed. One of the things that strikes you about reading the reform literature of this era is how clearly the reformers understood the mechanism they were up against. They were not naive about the way official morality served to protect the interests of particular groups while presenting itself as a universal standard. They wrote about this directly, in their pamphlets and their public letters and their testimony before parliamentary committees. They pointed out the specific logical contradictions. They named the specific inequities. And then they waited for the social retaliation that quite often followed, and kept going anyway. The public health reformers faced a different kind of resistance, but one that was equally rooted in the Victorian preference for not looking too directly at uncomfortable realities. Improving urban sanitation required, among other things, a frank acknowledgement of exactly how overcrowded and unhealthy working-class housing actually was. It required accepting, as a matter of public policy, that the conditions in certain parts of Victorian cities were dangerous, that the danger was traceable to specific causes, and that those causes were not the personal moral failings of the people who lived there but the predictable result of economic and physical circumstances. This was, in the context of the era's preferred narratives about poverty and personal responsibility, genuinely controversial. The sanitary reformers who made this case, who produced the reports, compiled the statistics, argued for the legislation, and pushed back against the idea that poverty was simply the inevitable consequence of individual character, were doing something that required intellectual honesty as well as practical persistence. They had to insist on looking at the evidence rather than the preferred story. And they won, eventually, unevenly, slowly. The great public health infrastructure that improved life in Victorian cities was built over decades, piece by piece, through a combination of lobbying, statistical argument, public pressure, and the occasional irrefutable outbreak that made the cost of inaction too obvious to ignore. It was not elegant. It was not fast. But it was real. The same is true of the legal reforms around women's position. They took decades. They were partial and piecemeal. They were often smaller than the reformers had argued for. But they accumulated. Each generation of reformers built on what the previous generation had managed to establish. And the changes in law once made created new social facts that the next generation could use as a foundation. What the reformers could not do, at least not immediately, was change the underlying social culture, the unwritten rules, the informal systems of reputation and punishment, the habitual ways of seeing and not seeing that had accumulated over generations. Those changed more slowly, when they changed at all, and the reformers often knew they would not live to see the full result of their work. They kept going anyway. That seems worth pausing on, for a moment, before we move on. Here is a question worth sitting with quietly. When people today talk about Victorian values, what are they actually describing? Because if you have been listening to any of this, you already know that the Victorian era was not, in practice, the era of strict and universal moral observance that the phrase tends to conjure. It was an era of elaborate moral performance, of significant double standards, of official codes that bent conveniently for the right people, and of an enormous gap between the values that respectable society professed in public and the realities it navigated in private. And yet the phrase endures, and people know roughly what it means, and it is used as shorthand for a kind of principled, traditional strictness that is contrasted with more modern permissiveness. How did we get from the complicated, contradictory reality to this simplified, idealized image? Part of the answer is simply the way historical memory works. We tend to remember the official story of any era more vividly than the unofficial reality, partly because the official story was designed to be memorable and partly because the unofficial reality left fewer authorized records. The etiquette books and the moral essays and the improving literature were printed and preserved and catalogued. The lived experience of people navigating the gap between those standards and their actual circumstances is often harder to find, recorded in private letters, in court documents, in medical case histories, in the kind of sources that take more effort to locate. Partly, too, the simplification reflects the genuine social seriousness of the Victorian moral project. The Victorians were not simply performing propriety without believing any of it. Many of them believed it sincerely. Many of the reformers who argued for the extension of those moral standards to the people they currently excluded were themselves deeply committed to the values they were citing. The argument was often, specifically, that the values the era professed were good values, that the problem was not the values themselves but the inconsistency with which they were applied. That kind of argument does not read, from the outside, as a rejection of Victorian morality. It reads as an appeal to it. So what actually changed and when? The legal changes came slowly and unevenly, but they did come. Married women's property rights were progressively extended in England over the second half of the 19th century, with major legislation in 1870 and 1882 that transformed the legal position of married women in significant ways. The grounds for divorce were gradually extended and made more equal. Though this process was extremely slow, meaningful reform in this area did not fully arrive until well into the 20th century, and in some respects extended to the 1960s and beyond. Public health infrastructure improved dramatically over the second half of the 19th century, with genuine reductions in certain previously endemic diseases as a direct result. Women's suffrage, the right to vote, which was perhaps the largest single legal change in the political position of women, was achieved in stages, partially in 1918 for women over 30 who met property qualifications, and fully on equal terms with men in 1928 in Britain. The suffrage movement built on decades of prior organizing around property rights, education, and professional access, and it, too, required remarkable persistence in the face of social retaliation of exactly the kind we have been discussing. But the cultural change, the shift in what could be said, what could be acknowledged, what was officially permitted to exist, was, if anything, slower than the legal change. There were decades of the 20th century that still operated by many of the social rules established in the Victorian era. The habit of polite evasion, the elaborate euphemism, the performance of decorum over the acknowledgement of reality, these persisted long past the specific legal structures they had been designed to support. And the flattened, idealized image of Victorian morality persisted alongside them, and in some cases outlasted them. By the late 20th century, when politicians and commentators began reaching for Victorian values as a political rallying point, the phrase referred to something that had been simplified almost beyond recognition, a picture of moral seriousness and social order that left out essentially everything we have been discussing this evening. The bankruptcies, the double standards, the patent medicines, the elaborate newspaper coverage of divorce cases, the sensation novels, the reformers arguing in public at personal cost that the system they were supposed to be defending was not, in fact, being applied fairly. Which is not to say that everything the phrase is meant to invoke is wrong. Seriousness about obligation, commitment to public improvement, the idea that society has responsibilities beyond individual comfort, these are genuine threads in Victorian thought and Victorian action. The reformers who built the sanitation infrastructure and the reformers who argued for legal equality were both, in their own ways, acting on Victorian moral commitments. But a version of Victorian values that includes only the propriety and not the hypocrisy, only the ideals and not the compromises, only the drawing room and not the city outside it, that is not really a historical reference. It is a piece of mythology. A useful mythology, perhaps, for various purposes. But mythology nonetheless. The honest picture of the Victorian era, the one that includes the complexity, is, if anything, more interesting than the simplified version. And perhaps more instructive too. Because the simplified version suggests that there was once a time when values were values and standards were standards and everyone lived up to them properly. And the honest version suggests that human societies have always been rather more complicated than their official stories acknowledge. That seems like a more useful thing to know. So let us pull the threads together, gently, before we let them go. The Victorian era was not simply an era of hypocrisy. That framing is too easy, and it gives us too comfortable a position to observe from. Hypocrisy implies conscious bad faith. People who knew perfectly well what they believed and chose to behave differently. And while that was certainly true of some Victorians, in some circumstances, it was not the whole story. Many Victorians were doing something more complicated than simple hypocrisy. They were living inside a system of social rules that they had partly inherited and partly constructed, a system that served real purposes for the people it protected and imposed real costs on the people it exposed, and they were navigating that system with the tools and the awareness available to them at the time. Every society does this. Every era produces a gap between its stated values and its lived reality. We are not different. We cannot be different. The gap is structural, because ideals are by definition aspirational and human behavior is by definition imperfect, and the distance between the two is where social life actually happens. What makes the Victorian case particularly interesting, and what has made it such a rich source of historical investigation, is precisely the era's own habits of documentation. The Victorians were, among other things, extraordinary record keepers. They produced official statistics and parliamentary reports and medical case histories and newspaper archives and published diaries and private correspondence on a scale that allows historians to reconstruct, in remarkable detail, both the official story and the reality that ran alongside it. They were, you might say, the authors of their own exposure. The evidence that allows us to see the gap between Victorian ideals and Victorian practice was, for the most part, produced by the Victorians themselves, in their professional capacity, in their private lives, in the reform campaigns they waged, in the court cases that produced those detailed newspaper reports. The Victorians were not uniquely two-faced, but they were, perhaps, uniquely well documented in their two-facedness. And that is a distinction worth making carefully, Because the first framing invites condescension and the second invites genuine understanding. Think of it this way. If you happen to be a future historian examining this moment in time, our moment, your moment, what would the evidence show? What would the gap look like between what we say we believe and how we actually live? Between our official commitments to fairness and the systems that, in practice, distribute fairness rather unevenly? Between our professed values and the specific arrangements we have made with ourselves about when those values apply? We probably cannot see our own gap as clearly as we can see the Victorians. That is, almost by definition, how gaps work. They are more visible from the outside than the inside. Future historians, working from the extraordinary archive of documentation that the digital age will eventually bequeath them, may find our own contradictions as illuminating as we find the Victorians. They may write about us with the same mixture of genuine fascination and gentle amusement that good social history tends to produce. And perhaps that is the most useful thing this particular piece of history can offer, at the end. Not a verdict on the Victorians, they were complicated like people always are, but a kind of perspective on ourselves. The gap between what we say and what we do is not a Victorian invention. It is a human one. The question is whether we are curious enough and honest enough to document it faithfully. And so we come back to the drawing room. You can picture it again, if you like. The heavy curtains, very properly drawn. The fire settled into its steady, unhurried warmth. The furniture solid and well chosen, everything in its correct position. The conversation, if there is any conversation tonight, careful and considered, the kind of talk that circles gently around the things that matter most and arrives at them, if it arrives at all, only sidelong. It is a room designed to keep certain things out. The noise of the city, certainly. The smell of the city. The complication and the mess and the too obvious humanness of the city, which goes about its business just the other side of those curtains with very little attention to the proprieties being so carefully observed inside. And just beyond the curtains, all of it. The streets still busy at this hour, or recently quieted. The pharmacist's shelves lined with their tastefully labeled remedies. The newspaper press still warm from the evening's run, churning out tomorrow's careful coverage of somebody's very unfortunate domestic circumstances, framed, naturally, as a matter of public concern. The reformers in their studies, drafting their arguments, steeling themselves for the response that will come when those arguments reach people who prefer not to hear them. The doctors who know considerably more than they are likely to say to a patient they have only just met. The patients who know considerably more than they are likely to say to a doctor they are not quite sure they trust. All of it tangled up together, the ideal and the real, the drawing room and the city, the careful performance and the actual life running alongside it like a river that has found its own course regardless of where the maps say it is supposed to go. Both rooms were real. Both were fully, completely, thoroughly Victorian. And here is what I want you to carry with you, as the last of the evening's conversation settles and the fire decides it has done enough work for one night. Every era tells itself a story, about what it values, about who it is, about the kind of people it aspires to be and the kind of society it is building, carefully and seriously, out of the materials at hand. And every era's lived reality, the actual daily business of actual human beings navigating actual circumstances, complicates that story in ways that are always easier for the next generation to see than for the people living through it. The Victorians are not unique in this. They are, in a way, simply the example we have most thoroughly documented. And perhaps, quietly, the most useful mirror we have, because their gap between appearance and reality is just far enough away in time that we can see it clearly, and just close enough that it still looks recognizably like something we might know. We have our own drawing rooms, you and I. Our own carefully maintained curtains. Our own preferred fictions about ourselves and our era, the ones we tell with such confidence that we have almost stopped noticing we are telling them. Perhaps, just for a moment before sleep takes over completely, there is something worth acknowledging in that. Not with judgment. Not with the kind of moral severity the Victorians themselves were so good at performing. Just with a little honest amusement. A little of that same gentle curiosity we have been practicing all evening. After all, noticing the gap, naming it quietly, smiling at it without collapsing into either denial or despair. That seems like a decent and reasonable and very human thing to do. And quietly admitting it, honestly, to yourself, in the dark, just before you sleep, well, that might just be the most Victorian thing of all. Now rest. The curtains can stay closed until morning.